Hello everyone and welcome to another casual review. Today I'm talking about Radiant Historia Perfect Chronology. This is a Nintendo 3DS game that is a remaster of the Radiant Historia DS game. I did some research before the Nintendo 3DS eShop was closing, and this is one of the titles that came highly recommended I purchased before I would have to shell out a small fortune for the physical version of this game. It is a turn-based JRPG. And the interesting thing about this game is the enemies are laid out on a 3x3 grid, and you have to manipulate these enemies' positions in order to maximize the amount of damage. So if there's an enemy right behind another one, it may be in your interest to push the enemies together, and then when you attack them, you're attacking both of them at the same time. So it adds an extra level of depth rather than, hey, I choose one enemy to attack and I attack them, and then they attack me, and then I choose another enemy. You're trying to position them all in this area so you can maximize hitting all of them at once. And so certain enemies have different directions that they can push enemies or pull them forward, and other characters that you play as target more groups or rows or X's or plus signs, and so you're just trying to position these enemies so that you can hit them all at once in one turn. Another interesting thing about the gameplay in this is you can change the order that the characters go in order to maximize these combos and these positionings, because once your combo is over, the enemies kind of spread out again, and so you want to group them all up and then just really wail on them and do a nice big combo before it's the enemy's turn again. There is one drawback to changing where your character's turns are in the turn order, which is once you change your turn, you are more vulnerable to critical attacks. However, the benefits far outweigh the drawbacks of changing the order of your turn to maximize your combos, that it's completely worth it. The plot of this game is fairly interesting in terms of its time-bending, parallel universe navigating scene here, which is actually quite popular, I feel like, in today's media in terms of like the whole parallel universe concept. So the main character is a man named Stock, and he's basically just like a really awesome spy in like a medieval type of magical world setting. And this world is actually dying due to desertification, where most of the land's inhabitable areas are turning into desert. And so there is a lot of war and conflict happening between the humans for the livable areas that actually still have like water and plant growth. And so you are playing as an S1 agent for one of these cities. And Stock kind of gets put into a sticky situation. He is designated as like this White Chronicle wielder. And the White Chronicle allows him to travel backwards, forwards in time, and also to more of like a parallel universe. They call it an alternate history. But basically you're navigating between like two different timelines. And originally when I got the White Chronicle and I learned about like the concept of like navigating through time and everything, I thought that it would be more of like a branching tree full of all these alternate realities and pathways, but I liked the way that they handled it better in terms of you have your main history and your alternate history, because even when you have just two different histories to keep track of, it can be a little difficult to trying to remember what happened in each timeline. And while they do align and have certain similarities, there are certain key points in the plots where you're like, wait, that guy's alive, and wait, how did we end up here? Because when you navigate down one of those histories, you can get fairly involved with the plot, but eventually you are going to have to navigate back to the other timeline in order to collect a key item or influence a certain character, because they do have some level of reflection on each other, these two histories. After you playing through one timeline about 2 hours in, then you go back to the other timeline and you're like, wait, where was I here? And which character was I playing with here? And so it can be a little difficult to keep track. Now, there are a couple other branching pathways off of these main two timelines, but they are very small and insignificant. They mostly take place in the form of like side quests. So like you'll talk to a guy, I really want a conut from this one area that you can only access with the other timeline. So items do carry with you, but then that creates a little branching path, and then it usually ends up in you getting some kind of reward, like a traditional side quest. Now, there are a a lot of moments, which I'm not sure why they did this, but there's a lot of moments where you have to make a key decision as Stock, and there's always clearly like a right answer and a wrong answer. So it's kind of like a choose your own scare book, where if you make the wrong choice, then the timeline ends in a death, and usually like the end of the world or one of the main characters dying. But you are always welcome to like just go back to that decision making point. And so it's not like you invest like a ton of time or anything like that, luckily, but it still is kind of weird because it's like, hey, make this decision. Do you want to go right or left? And you choose right. And then it says, okay, you turned right, and then this happened, and then Stock died. So let's go back, and then now you get to choose to go left. And so originally it felt kind of cool, like a choose your own scare book, but eventually, 20, 30 hours into this game, it felt like a waste of time, because it's just like, okay, which choice do I have to make just so I don't have to save and then go back to where I was when I had to make that decision. And it just felt like an additional they were really trying to like lean into this whole alternate timeline, time travel kind of concept. And so it didn't really, gameplay wise, it didn't really make sense, but for the plot, I thought it was cool, giving Stock the abilities to see like all these different timelines and how they end, so then he can make the perfect choice. You do have several allies in your party, so in total you have about 6 or 7 different playable characters, and I actually really enjoyed all of the characters, and I felt like each of their backstories was fairly fleshed out, and they all have their own stories and their own motives, which I really do like. The problem with this is Stock is the only one who is able to time travel through these different timelines and branching pathways, and these different nodes is what they're called, and they're basically like points in time that you can travel to. And so really Stock is the only one that you reliably get to play as the entire time. So in terms of like the RPG mechanics, like the levels and the amount of equipment that you put into your character and time upgrading them, it just makes the most sense upgrading Stock as much as possible, because you always get to play as Stock. You do have access to his 2 companions that he gets fairly early on, but not necessarily 100% of the time. So most of the time, yes, it's probably in your best interest to play as the first 3 characters that you have access to. But if you really want to play as some of the other characters, depending on where you time travel to on the timeline, you may not have access to them, and they may be fairly underleveled, because you'll be spending all this time battling enemies and leveling up with your certain characters, but the ones who aren't available in that timeline won't get that experience, and so they will be fairly underleveled and unplayable unless you intentionally go and to an area where you do have access to them and start grinding up enemies to keep them up to par with everybody else. This game didn't really make me feel like I needed to grind, but probably because I put most of my effort into Stock himself, so he was just an absolute powerhouse, and whatever 2 characters I happen to have along with him are more of just like assisting him in terms of like healing him and upgrading him and giving him additional turns. They do have like this arena setting in the White Chronicles itself where you have access to all of your characters, and so that is helpful in terms of like grinding, and this also gives you access to additional items and weapons and things like that if you do this enough, but it does feel pretty grindy as well. You're pretty much just facing off against the same enemies, going back and forth between these areas and collecting these resources and experience. In terms of initiating combat, it does have a system kind of like Paper Mario comes to mind, where if you manage to hit the enemy, you kind of like make them pass out or fall asleep. There's like Z's next to them, and then you can initiate combat, and you get a couple extra turns and moves before the enemy gets to move. So in the overworld, you kind of want to like hit them first before they touch you, so then you get an advantage going into battle. The combat system I think is really cool. The problem with the combat system is it doesn't really lend itself to grinding and gathering up experience and levels. And while I never really felt like I had to, I definitely felt like navigating through any of these levels could start to feel quite tedious because the combat was so lengthy. And there is like an auto battle kind of system, but it's just having them use their basic attack. and that can almost take as long as you actually playing and manipulating all of these enemies and grouping them all together so you can hit them all at once. They both pretty much take about the same amount of time. Only one of them, when you're manually playing, will save you a lot of loss of HP. And money is fairly hard to come by unless you are grinding and defeating every enemy that you come across. They are fairly stingy with the amount of money that they hand out to you, and so that's why most of the time I would recommend just purchasing all the best gear for stock, and then maybe like your two characters that you get fairly on in the game. I think Rainy and Marco, you're going to want to upgrade them second because they're going to be the second highest in levels, but also your gear, you want to invest the most in them most of the time as well. I also wish there was more opportunities to heal up my party. It felt like there weren't very many inns around that, you know, you could rest at and regain your HP and MP. Most of the time when I could tell that there was a boss fight coming, I would have to go to the White Chronicle, I would have to time travel back to a certain node where I know I have access to an inn, rest there, heal up my HP and MP, and then time travel back to the point that I was at, and maybe have to go through a couple of extra enemies before I encounter the actual boss. So I wish there was more opportunities to fully heal up my characters before a big fight. They do have certain items that you can use that fulfill this same purpose. However, these items cost about 5,000 currency as well, and like I said earlier, currency is kind of hard to come by, so it's almost in your best interest to navigate through time in order to find these inns, but it's a lengthy process, and so I wish there was just more opportunities, like more Pokemon Center equivalents that I could stop at and heal up my party. Only 3 characters can be in your party at one time, and so if all of your characters are leveled up, then maybe once some characters are low on health or mana, then you can swap them out for different characters, but then that brings up the whole problem of a lot of these other characters are going to be pretty underleveled and not as useful as your main party that you use. In terms of all the characters, all of them are voice acted, and actually voice acted fairly nicely. I quite enjoyed all of the dialogue between these characters, and that's also what helped me relate with these characters as well, is their excellent voice acting. Which is nice because this game is fairly dialogue heavy. You're going to be reading a lot of dialogue between these party members and characters in the plot, and a lot of text, and so it can be quite lengthy, almost at times will feel like a visual novel, I want to say. But this is nothing new to a traditional JRPG like this. The music is really nice, lots of piano. Also, it actually kind of reminded me of like Kingdom Hearts music. The game started feeling fairly long near the end. I was about 25 hours into the game, and while I did think I was near the end, I wasn't anywhere near the end. So I kept playing hour after hour, and I could feel my interest waning in the game, probably because I thought that the game was coming near an end, but it turns out that I still had like another 5 to 10 hours left in it. And so my impatience led me to dropping down the difficulty to friendly, which is really nice that they allow you to do that. The problem with dropping the game down to friendly is that you cannot raise the difficulty back up to normal during the particular fights that you want to play through legitimately. The cool thing about the friendly setting though, especially if you feel yourself getting bored of the game, it really helps you get through the game quicker, because you can strike enemies in the overworld and you will just automatically defeat them and gain the experience and resources, and it makes the gameplay a lot easier as well. So if you're a casual gamer, don't feel intimidated by putting this game on friendly. It is very hand-holdy at that point. And I did like that for like the grinding, navigating through the dungeons kinds of areas, but like as for the bosses, I wanted to raise this game back up to normal difficulty and fight against them legitimately. That being said, once I did drop this game down to friendly, it took me maybe like an hour or two to finally finish the game, and I could tell that it would have taken me a lot longer than that to play this game normally. And so I'd rather play this game through the end, even if I have to drop the difficulty down to friendly in order to see the whole thing through, rather than drop it off and just let it gather dust and never have that conclusion. Overall, I think the thing that makes this game stand the most apart is the ability to time travel and this grid combat system. It's definitely fun, but it's certainly overstayed its welcome. I'm going to give this game a 3 out of 5. If you did manage to acquire this game on the Nintendo eShop before the 3DS eShop closed, definitely give it a try. Otherwise, I'm not sure if it's worth the $100 that the physical copy is being sold at this point. Well, guys, that's it for me. Let me know if you have any questions or comments about Radiant Historia Perfect Chronology, and I'd love to hear what you have to say. Otherwise, I'll talk to you later. Bye!